morning, Mamlaka. Bwana Yesu asifiwe. I've been taught another Mwadhani Arogo show. Yeah, that's me getting a starter pack. I know some of you need it, a starter pack for the holidays. You need to know how to share a testimony. When you are called upon, you can start with that. But the people in the village also say, carry your chargers. Don't ask for Type-C at who has Type-C. You don't have iPhone chargers. So, and there the M-Pesa, you can't withdraw more than 5,000. So stop going and complaining, oh, how do you guys function here? Prepare yourselves. Christmas is often associated with a time of family, time to make merry, and a time of rest. And it is only 8 days away. So Merry Christmas. For those whom, once you go, your life pauses, and then it continues in mid-January. Happy New Year. It's not just a time to make merry. As Christians, we also take that opportunity to ponder on, we usually say, the reason for the season. We take time to ponder that. And this year, guided by the cue in Matthew chapter 1, we said we would do this through looking at the mothers of Jesus. The genealogy of Jesus does have 5 women mentioned, which is not a norm for the genealogies of ancient Israel. And so we said, what does the Lord have to say to us through these women that he has put here? And 2 weeks ago, Reverend Agagwa started us off by sharing with us on the story of Rahab. And today, I have the awesome privilege of taking us forward with another mother of Jesus. And the mother that we'll be looking at today is Ruth, the wife of Boaz. The book of Ruth, you could please stand with me there. We will be reading the first chapter, and then I'll give us a summary of how the story continues. It has all that make a good story or an enjoyable story. It is a simple plot, and eventually Ruth and Naomi prevail. But it is not just a good story. It has foundational principles that act as good guardrails for our life. I think it is often for us, we are reminded that life in and of itself has challenges. Even in the good of life, such as work, it has its days that it is difficult to think about how to make a product from your effort. And in such, there are seasons that are even more difficult than others. And I think coming to the end of the year, at the same time that we celebrate Christmas, there are things that lend themselves to spaces where we find ourselves a bit constrained and under pressure. I think it is a natural inclination to feel, after the whole year, let me analyze, how has my life been? It is a natural inclination to analyze and assess yourself, and then plan for the next year. As we think of family time, it is also to be noted that God did not spare us, that in family we would not face pain and suffering, some from the sins of our loved ones, and some just from life in and of itself. And so even as we gather to make merry, sometimes we have to deal with the family tension that has been there for generations. Nobody knows how it even started. It's just rumors here and there of how it started. Or sometimes it's a tension over something about distribution of property that created tension in the family. And when it is time to do the family gathering, you are waiting for that auntie to walk in. And you are even observing her facial expressions. Who will she say hi to? Who will she sit next to? That will be part of the conversations in the car on the way home. But sometimes it's not the sins of by us or others. It is the difficulty of life itself. Sometimes maybe you are headed into this holiday and you acknowledge that Kenya in general, its economy has been battered a bit. And in meeting your friends and family, you're going to meet that family member whose business collapsed this year. And you have no words for them. You're going to meet that loved one whom through the year they updated you on WhatsApp that they have a certain diagnosis. And you don't know what you will be saying to them when you meet with them. Or it's simply old age. You're going to meet your parents or maybe your grandparents, and you are going to have to deal with, they are now right here, seated across from me. And I don't know what to say to them. I think the book of Ruth has principles that guide us in such difficult moments. Because as we are going to read, it is not a book that starts on a high with good. It starts actually with a famine. So let us read Ruth chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. Now, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," Naomi said, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was started. The next chapter goes on to describe what their life looked like when they arrived in Bethlehem. You see, Bethlehem is an average town in Israel at that time, would have around 2,000 people. And so news goes around, "Hey, Naomi is back." And maybe somebody is asking, "And Malon was my friend. Kilion, we used to play with, where are they?" The age mates of Elimelech and asking, "Hey, where is Elimelech?" And you can understand Naomi's position as she has to explain, "My husband is gone. The two sons that I left with are also gone." You can understand why she says, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. Call me Mara, which is bitter. As they settle down, Ruth decides, "You know what? The Lord, in his faithfulness, has already provided for us a way in which we can sustain ourselves." Because in Leviticus 19, verse 9, God had instructed them and said, "When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings, leftovers of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God." And all in management said, "We are not the Lord." Sisi tutawaambia murudi huko and gather everything again. But in God's goodness, he had already provided a way in which if you are poor and destitute, you can still be provided for. And so Ruth takes initiative and goes out to glean. And in the evening, in the day, she comes to a certain farm. And this farm belongs to a man called Boaz, who happens to be a relative of Elimelech. And she works diligently, and Boaz comes later and notices her and grants her so much favor. Ruth is asking, "Hey, why am I getting such amount of favor from you?" And he's like, "You know what? I've already heard what you've done for your mother-in-law. I've heard how you left your home and your people to come and follow her here, knowing full well what awaited you here. You followed her." And he grants her favor. She's allowed Boaz tells her, "I've been told about all you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother." This is in chapter 2, verse 11. "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." He even asks the other laborers to drop a few things on the way so that Ruth has more to glean. And when Ruth comes and tells the mother-in-law in the evening what has happened and tells her, "It was in Boaz's farm that I was gleaning," Ruth says in verse 20, "The Lord bless him. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He's one of the guardian redeemers." Now, to think about the issue of redeemers, you have to think about how land was allocated in Israel. Remember, it's the Lord who gave them the land, and so he divided it through families. And he said, this family will take this area and this, and then they would go through not only the tribes, the 12 tribes, they would go through the clans up to the individual. I think you remember the story of Naboth's vineyard, right? And why he was hesitant to even sell the land. Because as the Lord had allocated them land, you couldn't just sell it. So if you sold it, you had to count how many years to the next Jubilee. So you'd count, the next Jubilee would be 50 years, so you'd count and say, okay, we've already lived 10 years, there are 40 years, so let me count 40 harvests for you and sell the land to you. Because when it gets to the year of Jubilee, this land reverts to its owners. And that's how the Lord had allocated the land. And so the Redeemer was sometimes somebody would get into hard times and sell the piece of land, and they would be allowed, if they got back money, they would go and redeem the piece of land and get back the piece of land, because they knew it is important that we keep the land as Yahweh had instructed us. But also sometimes a relative would redeem the land for you. So they would go and buy the land from the person you have sold. And so there was a procedure who could redeem land. Most likely there would be a right from maybe your brother, and then they would be going on that line until somebody else. But there was also something called, as a result of this, there was a levirate marriage. And this was in the cases where somebody died and God didn't want their name to be forgotten. He allowed that you could be married to somebody, a relative in the family. When instructed, it would usually be the brother. And then the firstborn boy in that marriage would continue the lineage of the deceased. And that's how God had structured that community. And so when Naomi here is like, that is one of our redeemers, there is all this at the background. A few weeks later, Naomi decides she wants to settle Ruth and tells her, I'd like to get your family. I'd like for you to have rest. And so they make this plan, and Boaz is approached, and Boaz accepts and says, hey, in the order in which or who can redeem, there is somebody else before me. And so that person is approached, and they say, no, I'm not interested in redeeming the land and taking Ruth the Moabite also. And so in chapter 4, let us read how the story continues after all this. Then Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among his family or from his hometown. Today you are witnesses. Then the elders and all the people in the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem, through the offspring the Lord gives you by this woman. May your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you, and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Aminadab, Aminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of Ruth, of David. As one considers this story of Ruth, I think as long as it might have felt as we read through it, you cannot but see two things that I think are helpful for us to glean from the book as we think about how we go through life in its various seasons and circumstances. And the first one is this, that we see the hands and decisions of men at work. And the second principle is that we also see the purposes of God at play. The hands of men at work, you can see that in the period of Judges. I think some of you know the stories of Samson, right? Have you heard of Jephthah? Have you heard of Gideon? Have we heard of Gideon? Okay. So these are spectacular times, right? We would hear that the Holy Spirit would come upon Samson and he would go and just demonstrate the power of God in what he was able to accomplish. And you have Gideon, who is able to defeat a whole army with such few men. Yet, interestingly, though this book is set in that time, there is nothing of that sort that is mentioned in the book of Ruth. The author seems to be intentional in helping us see the ordinary decisions of ordinary people living an ordinary life. Look what causes Elimelech to leave. Elimelech leaves Judah because there is famine. Even you would understand that. Machlon and Chilion take wives. Is that unreasonable? Look at, do you notice their cause of death? Did you notice their cause of death as we read along? It is not mentioned. It just says they died. As if to say, hey, death happens. Doesn't have to be, we focus on how it happened in a spectacular manner or what. No. It just says they died. Naomi initiates coming back to Judah because she hears, oh, God has visited the people and provided for them. When Ruth is accompanying her mother, Naomi decides to settle her. And what is Naomi's intention? Nothing about, oh, God is sovereign and he's trying to achieve this. No. He just says, hey, I want to find you rest. And therefore, I will find a husband for you. And what about Boaz? He doesn't sit back. When he is approached, he immediately says, hey, stay here for the night, and in the morning, if the other redeemer wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord's will, I will do it. Lie here until morning. Another just ordinary decision by Boaz. And what does Naomi respond when she hears of this? She says, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. None of these people saying, hey, the Lord is at work in our midst. The author presents them as just making ordinary decisions in an ordinary people living an ordinary life. When you consider Ruth, she clung to her mother-in-law. When she makes that big decision, when she says, hey, have you considered the decision she was making? She's been told, hey, there is no hope in going with me. You won't have a husband. At that time, Naomi does not mention about the levirate marriage. She just tells them, hey, if you come with me, your only option is I have kids. And since you can't wait until they are grown up to marry, that's not an option for you. But she makes this commitment. And we are not told she was aided by the Holy Spirit. The author just leaves it to us as she made a decision. A big decision. To say, hey, I will cling to you. And she says this, even upon your death, where you die, I will be buried. These are stronger vows than what we even use for marriage. I know some of us say, even if you die, I'll continue. But the Lord released you. The Lord said, hey, till death do us part. Because Jesus tells us in heaven there is no marriage. When she is instructed to go to the threshing floor where she initiates the conversation with Boaz, Ruth actually says, hey, I will go. And she obeys the mother-in-law. She's not waiting for an angel to come down and instruct her. It looks like ordinary decisions in ordinary life. And I believe you also have such decisions in your life. As you analyze and look back on the year, you made ordinary decisions about what you would like to do in this 2023. Some of us might be thinking, hey, 2023, my plans didn't turn out that well. Maybe I should just walk into 2024 without plans. Let's just take it with the punches as we roll and go along. And you know, there is a certain joke that goes around. In the new year, you said, these were my 2023 goals, and you had them written down. Now you just go and cross the 3 and put a 4 there, and you're like, okay, let's go on. Or maybe we talk about how we make resolutions, and by March, we no longer hold on to them. Would we consider Ruth and how she makes decisions that become very impactful? When she decides to go with Naomi, she's not thinking, hey, there is a Jesus and a David coming. No, she just makes an ordinary decision. And God, in his own mercies, decide, hey, it is on this lineage that David and Jesus will be born. So as you make decisions on discipleship, on parenting, on whether to pursue that relationship and restore it, it seems to have pleased the Lord that his purposes will be achieved in our lives as we make ordinary day-to-day decisions. So I pray that you would take them with the gravity that they are. That as you meditate on the year, you'll actually say, hey, I need to be intentional in 2024. God's purposes are being achieved through my decisions. But it's not just that is at work here. We also see the purposes of God at play. You see that in thinking, when you consider that in Ruth, there is actually a preservation of the genealogy of Jesus. And how does God do that? He even sets gleaning laws initially, not only for Ruth, but for every foreigner. He knows full well what this will accomplish in the future. At that time, nobody is thinking about there being a Ruth or a David. But God has his mind on the future, and he sees all. When he says there will be a levirate marriage, he has already seen the future, and he knows what he will accomplish through this. Do you notice that Ruth was married before, and now she is married a second time, and we are told simply she had a child. God's purposes in how he achieves them in our lives. Think of what Naomi said before when she comes to from Moab. He says, change my name because I went full and I have come empty. Do you know what the women tell her later? She tells her, you know this Ruth that you came back with? She is better to you than 7 sons. Now, 7 to them was not a magical number. It was just a number that represented fullness. Or if you were thinking the greatness of something, you'd say its fullness is getting them 7. When Jesus is speaking about forgiveness, he'll tell people, forgive 7 times 7, 70 times 7. So it was just a number to show the fullness of something. So while Naomi is coming back and is thinking, I have come back empty, God is looking at her and is saying, okay, time will tell. In due time, people will look at you and say, you had the fullness of what you wanted right there beside you in Ruth the Moabite. When it is harvest, it is said that God had visited them and given them food. Have you ever considered, if you've ever read the book of Ruth, the coincidences that happened so that Ruth would meet Boaz. It just says, hey, she came to the part of the field owned by Boaz. It so happens that on the day she's there, after she has worked very diligently, the manager, as we would see him, notices her. That when Boaz comes and asks, the manager actually has a good commendation concerning her. That Boaz, by that time, has already had a reputation of Ruth. All these coincidences put together to ensure that when Boaz meets with Ruth, he will favor her. So as you think about your life and think about who Ruth was, a Moabite. The origin of the Moabites was from an incestuous relationship between Lot and the daughters. And guess what? It was such a thing that even a Moabite could not be accepted into the assembly for worship until several generations later. Do you know when the Israelites didn't look upon the Moabites with favor? Because when the Israelites were leaving Egypt and coming, there is a king who had what they had already done to other kings. His name was Balak. You guys know the story of a talking donkey? So Balak sends for Balaam and says, hey, come and curse these guys so that they don't do what they've done to other kings to us. And maybe if you cast them, when we go to war with them, we have a chance of winning. So the Israelites don't look at the Moabites and say, hey, you are our relatives, you are our friends, no. They do not like them. And yet, God in his own purposes chooses to have a Moabite as one of the mothers of Jesus. So, what is it that disqualifies you? What do you look and say, hey, God doesn't give consideration for me? Are there times in your life you are thinking, hey, this is so tough, I feel left alone. I feel nobody cares about me. If God could act through the lives of ordinary people to bring much fruit and to preserve the lineage of Christ, there is nothing that stops you from being favored by God and from him looking at you with favor and preserving you in whichever way he deems fit. And I believe at this time, as we gather here, there might be some who are amongst us and they're thinking, hey, I would love such a thing. But you do not have a relationship with Jesus. For one reason or another, you have maybe postponed it. It has tugged in your heart several times. Or you just don't care. Now, what we know is that in our time and season, that God assures that he has good plans and cares about each and every believer. But for one who's not in a relationship with him, he has nothing good to say. And so if you're here and that is you, there are pastors here, and if you feel the loud tugging in your heart, please approach them and have a conversation with them. But it would also mean that if we know people who do not have a relationship with Jesus, I hope that since we know that God achieves his purposes through our actions, that we would also take the initiative to share the gospel with them. For Christmas is but a beginning of what Jesus Christ had come to do in our lives. He had come to save people who were lost in darkness, and he wanted to bring them into the kingdom of light. So as we meditate on Christmas, may we also consider those, yes, who are poor and sojourners in us, but let us also consider those who are amongst us and are lost in the kingdom of darkness. And pray and hope and think of ways that you, through your human ordinary decisions could be a part of reaching them for the sake of the gospel. Allow me to conclude by this. In 1939, this is the World War, and things are thick. In September, the king has made promises, and he has made this powerful speech to the people. I think it's part of movies nowadays. And he has told the British, we're going to this war, and here we're going to fight. By December, Britain has lost a lot. Its warships, its soldiers, they are counting their losses. And so the king still has a Christmas address to make. And in it, as he's thinking of a people who are battered and in difficulty, he decides to quote a poem. And so I'll read the introduction for you. This poem is called The Gate of the Year. God knows. So in his speech, he quoted, and he said, "And I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown. And he replied, go out into the darkness and put your hand in the hand of God. That shall be to you better than the light and safer than a known way. So I went forth, and finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night. And he led me towards the hills and breaking of day in the lone east." I encourage you that as you reflect on your year, do not look at the faithfulness that you have lived with this year and assume it counts for nothing. Do you notice that Naomi and Ruth will never know that Jesus was coming into their lineage? It is we that have the privilege to look at her and say, hey, what an honorable thing for you. And so as you live your life in faithfulness, though it might not look like it, you look at the effort versus the fruit and say, was it worth it? Consider that God is not done with your story. Even at the point of death, he still uses your decisions to achieve his purposes in life. So all the faithfulness to which you have lived before God is of value and precious before him. But as you also make decisions for the future, I pray that you would entrust yourself to him. For you know not what the decisions you will make next year will achieve in the fullness of time. And so put your hand in the hand of God, and it will be to you better than light and safer than the known way. May the Lord bless you and keep you.